1917, the Milton Keynes Labour Party celebrated its 100th birthday. This film tells the story of some of the significant events and personalities in that 100-year history through original documents and recorded interviews with local people and party members. Even before 1917, there had been some action in the area. With the arrival in North Bucks of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century in the form of the railways, its workers started to organise themselves in a variety of ways to improve their lot. In 1877, the Wolverton and District Cooperative Society was formed, and in 1891, the first local trade union was created, the Amalgamated Society of Railway Servants, whose 60 members paid 5p a week subs for assured death benefits, orphan support and out-of-work supports. In 1911, 1,000 men, about a quarter of the workforce, came out on strike at Wolverton Works in support of a national railway strike. In Bletchley, the response was less enthusiastic. Only one train driver heeded the strike call, and that was Alan Wells, a man who was to play a significant role in the early history of the North Bucks Labour Party. Local women were fighting for their social justice too. In 1915, they went on strike from a Corkadale Printers of Wolverton in a dispute about equal pay.
I don't know whether everybody went down into the warehouse entrance, but that's where we congregated. Sis actually got up on a box and started talking to everybody while this was going on. I'm not sure whether they blew the whistle, but at any rate they sent us home. We called it a lockout, not a strike. I think it was a fortnight that we were out. Sis became secretary of a branch of the trade union, and from that we went on.
Whilst this was happening on the home front, the horrors of the Great War continued across the Channel. In 1917 there were monstrous battles at Arras and Passchendaele and unrestricted submarine attacks on shipping. The effects were felt at home too, with bread rationing and bombs from Zeppelins. It was in these febrile circumstances that the Wolverton and District Trades Council convened a conference of 100 delegates from 18 trade unions and 5 cooperative societies on the 5th of May 1917. Held in the Science and Arts Institute in Wolverton and presided over by Harry Cook, the object of the conference was to form a Labour Party for North Bucks. Among the officials elected at the historic meeting were Albert Brown from New Bradwell as president and Alan Wells from Bletchley as secretary and his older brother Oliver as one of the vice presidents. 18 months later, the nation celebrated the end of the Great War, but celebrations were to be short-lived.
My dad sat here, he said, they're cheering now, but they won't cheer in a few years' time, he said. Didn't they? Won't cheer, he said, for a little while. Didn't they? And it was good.
A general election was called immediately after the war ended for December the 14th, 1918. It was the first election to be held after the Representation of the People Act 1918, giving the vote to women with property and over the age of 30 and to all men over the age of 21. The new electorate was wooed with gusto by an emergent party now flexing its muscles for huge change. But the local Labour Party's first parliamentary candidate faced an uphill task.
John Skur put up here for Labour man, and I wouldn't let him speak outside the work there, you know. All they booed him and everything else, see. I wouldn't let him speak. Then I thought, well, If they ain't going to let anybody speak, we can never get anywhere, shall we? But anyway, that changed my attitude.
Although John Skerr failed to become the first Labour MP for the Buckingham constituency in that election, the sense of social injustice for the working man grew irrevocably. In October 1925, 6 months before the general strike, Wolverton railwaymen staged a sit-in about working conditions, successfully. The 1925 Wolverton Dispute Committee included Harry Cook, who had presided over the inaugural meeting of the Labour Party 8 years previously, and Albert Brown, who was chair of the branch Labour Party. Albert Brown lived in New Bradwell, which for inhabitants of nearby Wolverton already had a reputation for radicalism.
You know why that was? Because there's many Labour people down there. That's why it was called Little Moscow. Russians.
At the start of the general strike in May 1926, Albert Brown, known locally as Bolshe for his militancy, stood on the flat roof of the shops opposite the works entrance and shouted to the men to "Follow me!" After the strike, many union activists, including Harry Cook, were victimised by the railway company, but in a move which caused some controversy, Albert Brown was offered a managerial position which involved hiring workmen. Brown was a staunch Baptist. It was well known that if you were in the Baptist congregation in New Bradwell, you'd be found employment in the railway works. This led to vociferous stand-up arguments in the street with the Reverend Joey Guest, Anglican priest of St James's, New Bradwell.
When you've got all your disciples in the works, Brown, he said, don't forget some of mine.
The general strike was just the beginning of hard times for working families in North Bucks. The Depression took its toll, even on the normally secure railway industry, with many families living on the dole.
I got on the mains test, and they come round and they knocked threepence a week off. I had 26 shillings a week to keep the baby, my eldest son, and my wife, 26 shillings a week. They came round and knocked threepence a week off because my old dad worked in Wolverton Works. That turned me straight away. I don't want to get into politics, but I've never voted Tory since.
In these desperate times, the Labour Party locally went from strength to strength. In 1933, a new Labour Hall was opened in Wolverton, and meetings were held in Stony Stratford, Bletchley and New Bradwell. One of the party's founders, Oliver Wells, was by now a well-respected councillor and would be co-opted to the North Bucks Education Committee. Born in Bletchley in 1874, he had worked on the railway as a locomotive fireman. At the age of 17, he'd been elected to the Bletchley Committee of the UK Railway Temperance Union. In 1900, at the age of 26, he suffered a terrible accident on the railway, which resulted in him losing both his legs. After the accident, Oliver left the railway and for 15 years had his own business as a boot and shoe repairer in Duncombe Street. He had stood unsuccessfully for the council in 1908, before the Labour Party was established locally, and although not elected until 1930, he remained as branch secretary of the NUR for many years. His achievements would be recognised decades later when a new special school in Milton Keynes would be named after him, now the Redway School. In 1934, the first edition of the Bletchley Gazette was published, with the motto, "A bigger, brighter, better Bletchley." It was edited by a young Ron Staniford. But it wasn't until after the war that Ron, as leader of the Labour-controlled Bletchley Urban District Council, was able to play a large part in getting that motto realised. With the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, efforts turned to dealing with home front issues. The railways were a reserved occupation, and it was not until later in the war that many men were conscripted. But one Labour Party member, Ray Belchambers from New Bradwell, made his case for conscientious objection.
I'd been involved in the Labour Party since I was about 14 or 15, I suppose, and had always taken the international point of view, and had always thought that the only sensible way for mankind was a sort of internationalism and a cooperation amongst nations. You know, it sounds very highfalutin and idealistic now, but it wasn't then. And we believed then that we could get enough cooperation amongst individuals, we could achieve something. And if war started, then that was the end of cooperation, and it was the end of all sensible conversation with any other nation. So my view was that the only thing to do was to refuse to go.
With the end of the war in Europe in May 1945, political parties had just over 6 months to prepare for the general election in October. Ray Belchambers was the Labour Party agent and helped secure an historic first ever win for a Labour Party candidate, Aidan Crawley, in the Buckingham constituency. The new Labour government steamed into action with its programme of nationalisation, including that of the railways, creating the National Health Service and transforming education and housing. It enacted 75 pieces of legislation in just its first year. In spite of this, a shock awaited Labour in the 1951 general election, when although the party received 250,000 more votes and a visit locally from Prime Minister Attlee, they won fewer seats. The nation reverted to a Conservative government, and locally Aidan Crawley lost his seat to Frank Markham, himself a former member of the Labour Party. Meanwhile, in Bletchley, the Labour administration on Bletchley Urban District Council was making bold plans to expand and develop the town. Through their efforts, they were able to offer new houses to those in housing need in London and to attract and welcome new industry to give those new arrivals employment opportunities. It was facilitated by the government passing the Town Development Act.
The Town Development Act envisaged that the development would be controlled by the local authority, aided by block capital grants from the government. And Bletchley had gone so well in starting on this that the Act had to be backdated to pick up what Bletchley had done. So it was about 1951 when we were all legal, and we carried on with development. We put in a new sewage works, new water works. We spent lashings of money, and the council, we used to sit through till 2 o'clock in the morning. Oh, we did work. Just 12 people handling this development, 12 councillors, and just a town clerk and a surveyor, and not even a full-time medical officer, with a skeleton staff of just, a handful of people. We started on the development of Bletchley. I'm very proud of that.
You've a job for life, said your old man, but he didn't reckon with the beaching plan. Now we don't build new, we just repair.
Whilst positive growth was taking place in Bletchley, the Conservative government asked the chairman of the newly created National Railways Board, Dr. Beeching, to review and reform the railway system. The reshaping of British Railways, or the Beeching Plan as it became known, was published in 1963. Its recommendations had a devastating effect on the job prospects of those involved in the railway industry in Bletchley and Wolverton, and on railway services in the North Bucks area. There was a particularly strong protest against its station closure by Castlethorpe residents. and they were joined by the Labour Party's parliamentary candidate, Robert Maxwell, who had been nominated in 1959 and who went on to win the seat for Labour in the 1964 election. Robert Maxwell was Marmite to members of the constituency Labour Party, causing great divisions between the Wolverton and Bletchley branches of the party.
I've been told by many people that, oh no, we don't pay, Mr Maxwell pays for us.
He would organise these days out for them and hire a train or a train carriage, and they'd all go to the Bletchley Labour Party, would all go to the seaside and things like that. It was, quite a paternal sort of arrangement, it seemed to me.
It was quite clear that there were people who were pro-Maxwell and there were people who were very anti-Maxwell.
Divided right down the middle between those who lived in Bletchley and supported Robert Maxwell and those who lived in Wolverton, New Bradwell, who hated his guts. I was always warned of the fact that where you sat in the room at the general committees predetermined which side you were on, even though Maxwell had long since disappeared when I appeared on the scene.
On the 23rd of January 1967, perhaps the most dramatic change of all came to North Buckinghamshire when the Labour government of the day announced the designation of the area as the site for a new town, or new city as it was known. As the new city developed in the 1970s, so did the local Labour Party, with an influx of new arrivals whose outlook and views often clashed with the long-established members.
And the driving force of a constituency is its general management committee. The problem was that a number of the women that went, we had to make sure they weren't put off, because if they'd stand, you'd hear people, from Bletchley and from Long Eaton and all of that. It would be, hello dear, hang on, there's a lady speaking. Gradually over the years, in the late 70s and early 80s, the influence of the newer people coming in to Milton Keynes tended to hold sway, because they had Linford being a new branch, Watling and Central being a new branch, and very big branches would send 10 delegates to the local authority. Wolverton, not growing, would send the same 6. Now, it had the people on that 6 were people who had kept the Labour Party going for a long, long time, during the Maxwell days and before that. So people like Frank Atter, tremendous man, absolutely tremendous man.
You shouldn't forget that Frank at one point was the only Labour member of Bucks County Council. He used to have to get Tories to second his motions, but he still battled on.
He was a very nice man, and I liked him a lot, but I probably didn't show that much to him. He probably still saw me as one of the enemy.
He saw anybody who hadn't worked in the works or who came from the Open University or as militant, and they weren't. Not by any means were they. They were just, socialist supporters who'd come from different parts of the country. I mean, we weren't all 12.
We were all young, in our 30s, and ambitious to get somewhere. And as far as we saw it, we had a whole load of old fogey councillors who were holding us back.
We got on with what we wanted to get on with, and in a way pushed a lot of the local people who had lived in the area prior to Milton Keynes out of the way, and I think that was fairly ruthless.
I'm young, I perceive myself to be left-wing and radical, and I see what I believe to be people who are old, past it, right-wing, institutionalised and all the rest. So most of these people I saw in the sense of, we need to move you on and need to move us in, as it were.
There was certainly resentment of some of the newcomers coming in, but I think as much as anything it was about change, and they identified new ideas in the branches as being typical of this change, not as if people coming in were going to sweep things aside for the sake of it. And that didn't actually happen.
Arguably the most significant, most far-sighted decision ever was made at that time, when lots of people wanted the authority to be called North Buckinghamshire, and some people stood out and said, no, we're going to call it Milton Keynes.
The Labour Party was the majority party in 1974, when Milton Keynes Council was created. And it lasted through to 76, 77.
However, the Labour Party locally was in opposition until 1990, apart from a brief period in 1986 to 87. But even in opposition, there was still the possibility of bringing about real change.
I recall conspiring with Brian White when we didn't have a majority, in fact we were a minority, but finding ourselves in a majority on one particular night in one particular committee when recycling was on the agenda, and scribbling notes between us as to how far we could push the recycling target up because of new policy in those days, as a kind of objective that the council would achieve in the next 2 years. And that became council policy on the back of the fact there was a couple of Tories not there that night.
At the time of the 1992 general election, which Labour was expected to win, Kevin Wilson was the candidate for the marginal seat of Milton Keynes South West.
I was on line to win, and I was one of the seats that was going to form a Labour government along with Neil Kinnock and all the rest. But I recall vividly the very night when I realised it wasn't going to happen. And I was on Bean Hill at the time. And you remember that election's always paraded as one that Labour was going to win, and suddenly it fell away in the last few days, and that's the way it's seen. And I could recall that, and I remember that last week. And I remember knocking on this door on Bean Hill, and this young woman, about 25, 26, answered the door. And she said to me, she said, "Oh, Kevin," she said, "I'm sorry, she said, I'd like to vote for you, but I can't afford it." And I said, "What do you mean you can't afford it?" I'm not asking any money, of course, for the vote. She said, "No," she said, "I can't afford it." She said, "Let me show you something." He went back and bought a copy of the Sun newspaper, and there it was, £1,000 tax bombshell. She said, "I haven't got £1,000. And she'd just been told and read that she was going to have to pay £1,000 if we won. So, and I just knew, well, I spent another 15 minutes with this woman and persuaded her that this was just what it was, propaganda from Murdoch and the Sun. But so she was persuaded, but I knew that behind her was another tens of thousands of people who were going to think the same, and of course that's what happened.
In 1996, local elections were held for the new unitary authority, Milton Keynes Council, and Labour was the majority party.
That was a good moment. It lasted for about a couple of years, I think. Then things began to decay, deteriorate, mainly because we discovered gradually over a period of time that we'd been completely shafted by Bucks County Council, and the deal was 1/3 of the resources would go to Milton Keynes and 2/3 to the rest of the county, which was, a rough and ready way of calculating things. But we found, for example, that the youth service was set up to spend 3 or 4 times the amount that had been allowed for, and so we had to strip huge sums of money from things like the Environment Directorate and put that money into education, particularly because Tony Blair said education, education, education.
The one thing that most people will probably remember me forever is holding the council tax referendum in 1999. The first ever and last ever successful council tax referendum. 47% turnout, supporting what were then quite big increases and busting through the then capping mechanism. So it happened because it had to happen, because we were so badly done by with the merging of the two authorities that something had to happen, otherwise we'd still be in trouble now. But it was a really significant move at the time.
Between the 1996 unitary council elections and the 1999 referendum came the 1997 general election, arguably Milton Keynes Labour Party's finest achievement in its 100-year history.
In 1992, we'd had the devastating hit where we thought we were going to win and didn't. None of us wanted to go through that same pain in May 1997 that we went through in April 1992. So it was a critical bit about ensuring that there was a machinery, that there were candidates and that there were people
The selection of 97, obviously it was a women-only shortlist, 50% of the 100 target seats. And that is what ensured that that the representation of women in Parliament suddenly massively increased.
Beryl Mortimer was Phyllis's agent.
I was astounded. Why on earth anybody suggested me? Why on earth should I do it? I don't know anything about what an election agent does.
Beryl was an amazingly good agent, tremendously efficient and calm, and really great at the organising side of things and getting all of that going.
I remember Phyllis being, somebody who was enormously aware of the responsibility she was carrying. She needed to win in order for there to be a Labour government. She could and ought to win it, but was she going to win it? That anxiety. So she was incredibly hard-working and committed to the place.
I do recall a particular visit with Prescott, where we stopped outside the shopping centre on a terribly windy day to sort of speak to people, and he kind of handed over to me to start, and I did my best, but my voice doesn't carry greatly outside, and hid the sort of shock and horror on Prescott's face as he realised, Christ, they're not being able to hear a word this candidate's saying, and so he sort of grabbed the placards from me and launched into a great Prescott speech, which obviously he was massively better at projecting his voice than I was, and getting attention out there.
We just thought we'd get Phyllis in, and Brian do okay. And then about 10 days before, I think it was about 10 days before the actual day of the election, of course the postal votes come in and they start counting them, and the agent, who was Les Munn, I think, was allowed to go and watch it.
Les rang me up and he said, Rob, I'm not sure how I'm going to explain this to Brian. I think he's going to win. And we both went, well, what we want was not suitable for public consumption.
In the last week of that 3-week campaign, it's difficult to explain it, but you suddenly felt there is something going on here. There is a huge enthusiasm here. This is not normal. This is going to be an amazing result.
I think the 1st of May 1997 will always be my favourite day ever.
By the time dawn came and the third recount in Milton Keynes Police, we'd won that as well. So they were days that will never be repeated.
And in the morning the sun shone, and I remember we had chocolate muffins round at Rob Gippers' house for breakfast.
Being in the House of Commons meant that our 2 MPs could get things done for Milton Keynes.
I was particularly pleased that one of the first things that I was able to do in Parliament was to ensure that we did not get grammar schools in Milton Keynes. I mean, you will probably recall there'd been a long campaign pursued by the Labour Party and the councillors to block a grammar school, and the point it had reached at the point of 97 was that the council had applied for a judicial review of a decision by Gillian Shepherd, the Secretary of State for Education. So basically the grammar school was on hold. Soon after I got elected in the House of Commons, I managed to speak to David Blunkett. I was coming down the stairs from the chamber to back to my office, and as I walked past I could see this black Labrador's tail sort of flapping up and down, and I thought, dog, Blunkett, he's in there. I will wait until he comes out from his telephone call, and then I will speak to him about the grammar school issue and what he's got to do to make sure that we don't get grammar schools. So I loitered about, grabbed him and said, what I need you to do, David, is go back to your officials and tell them not to oppose the judicial review. And that is what he did. He told his officials, don't oppose the judicial review. So the government case was not put, and the council triumphed by default, and there was no grammar school in Milton Keynes.
In 2007, a new young Labour Party member came to Milton Keynes and got involved. But what were his first impressions?
Like all Labour parties at the time, moribund is a bit of a strong word, but it's that sense of we were in the last years of the Brown and Blair government, and I think there was tended to be a little bit of disillusionment with what had gone before.
That moment coincided with the decision of some long-serving members of the local party that it was time for them to make way for a new generation.
2008, and I thought, I've done 30 years in local government now. This must be a good time to stand down and retire. And at that time, about a year earlier, 2 years earlier, I come across this young woman, fresh out of Queen's University in Belfast, who wrote to me and said, I see you do surgeries on a Saturday morning, could I come and see what happens one day? That young lady was called Hannah O'Neill.
And before I knew it, I was, Kevin was lining me up for all these positions. So I was really lucky in that respect. I don't think, had that not happened, I don't think I would have necessarily found myself in politics. It was never where I thought people like me ended up. And from there, I was on the parish council. I think I was a parish councillor within a few months of starting to work with Kevin.
So I remember having made up my mind that this was a good time to go, and realising I'd found a really, really good person to hand on to. I said, Hannah, how do you fancy standing for my seat next year?
And he asked me to kind of put myself forward in his place, which I did, and that's how I became a councillor in 2008.
It's us lot that were the young people then that have become the older guard now, as it were. But there are there are more young people, there are more women, there are more, I find a generally more relaxed attitude.
The support that I was given, particularly by the women of the kind of the group in particular, so Camilla and Jan Lloyd, it was phenomenal. They really supported me, and not just women. Norman Miles as well was brilliant at kind of really encouraging me and bringing me on. And certainly when he was leader of the group, and I was the chair of the group, I was really encouraged, and it was a really fantastic experience, to be honest.
I got elected in 2011, and it was a really crap time, I think, for the Labour group at the time. There was only 9 people like Reg Edwards and Jan Lloyd who had been around a long time, and rightly so, because they were good councillors. But it was coming to the end of that era, and Norman was leader. And then basically in 2013, Norman decided he was going to stand down, and we'd gone up to about 15 by then. And we had all our elections coming in 2014, so I became group leader. Purely for the fact that it's that sort of serendipitous thing that I became a member of a group that was in a transition phase, and then in 2014 we obviously won the all-out election.
And that was an incredibly stressful morning. I remember Pete pacing up and down at the count because we were doing really well, which was brilliant. That wasn't why it was stressful, but it was the possibility that we were going to suddenly become a majority, which none of us had expected, and we just we fell short of that just slightly, but no one expected us to do as well as we did, and that was phenomenal. But taking power was difficult. We'd had kind of 3 years of a Tory administration that had done very little, and there was a lot of work to do. Faced with an opposition that felt that we were too young, that we shouldn't have been doing it, we shouldn't have been in power, that we didn't know what we were doing. But I think we worked really hard, and we got some really good things in early. So we kind of got the cooperative council in early. We did this, we pushed through, started building council houses really early. We started to look at the minimum, the national living wage really early. So we did all those kind of big things really early. And I think that really set the tone of what we wanted to do as an administration. And I think we've kind of moved forward, and we've got a really strong record, I think, in terms of what we've delivered on the council in the last 4 years.
I've always been cognizant and aware of the fact that there are people like Rob Gifford and Nigel Long and Brian and Kevin who have got decades of experience, and it's a really healthy position for me to be in, because if there's an issue, you don't reinvent the wheel. It's probably happened before. Just a phone call to Kevin or a phone call to Nigel often leads them to say things like, oh, I had this problem back in 1992 or something like that. And so it's brilliant, and it's a pleasure really to be able to lead the Labour Party, particularly in its 100th birthday in Milton Keynes.
We reject the politics of austerity.
Nationally, the Labour Party was in turmoil following the leadership campaign in 2015. The surprise election of Jeremy Corbyn was a result of a massive growth in membership of the party, particularly of young people. Amongst older party members in Milton Keynes, there were doubts about the party's future electability.
The challenge has been the same challenge it's always been, though it's taken me a long time to understand this, that you cannot win an election from just within your own agenda or own framework. Any party can have what I call a 20% strategy, 15 to 20% strategy. You coalesce around a set of views which will attract 15 or 20% of the population to vote for you, you'll be in opposition. If you want to be in government, you have to go for a 40% window, which means you have to step outside your comfort ground into the ground of other people's.
The influx of new young members into the local party evoked memories of the impact the new arrivals to Milton Keynes had had on established party members some 50 years previously.
Yeah, some of the people in Milton Keynes Labour Party held it together during some pretty tough, some tough times. The party was under extreme, pressure over the war, and a lot of people were very, very critical of some of its policies on, as I say, on austerity. And yet some of these guys are here in Milton Keynes had kept on, walking on the streets and knocking on the doors and representing that party, and to their credit, had even won a minority on the council. So then when this huge bunch of people suddenly shows up, people like me, who many of them are quite relatively young, or maybe some inexperienced in politics, some very experienced for over many years in politics, and start saying, oh, you're doing this wrong, that wrong, and that wrong. Well, it's a bit like, hold on a minute, where have you been? You've just shown up. So I understand that slight, the reservations that they might have been had there. But at the same time, and I think all of the sort of old guard, if you want to call them, recognise is that we are a movement of people, and actually having thousands of more members is a great thing for the party. It's just a matter of finding out how you mobilise them, how you engage them, and how you meld together all the experience of what's gone before with the new ideas and new enthusiasm, which is still going on and will go on, and is a challenge to the current chair of the party, and will be a challenge to whoever comes along next as well.
I have just chaired a meeting of the Cabinet where we agreed that the government should call a general election to be held on the 8th of June. I want to explain the reasons for that decision, what will happen next, and the choice facing the British people when you come to vote in this election.
2017 general election was, without doubt, the most incredible 2 months of my life, because of the roller coaster ride that we went on, and ultimately the things that were achieved. When it was called, there was, especially amongst people like me who'd argued that Corbyn was a winner, we had to prove it, and we had no time to prepare whatsoever, which was crazy. So it wasn't, I'll be honest, it probably wasn't the most coordinated and planned campaign, but it was certainly a case of, right, let's go.
I will say that was just unexpected, on a sudden. It says that, oh, that is a general election, so we are not even prepared for anything, and we don't have enough budget, we don't have enough fund, and we were thinking that what to do, but we did really well. We did really well, especially I'm really happy that we had two good candidates, Hannah O'Neill from the MK South and Charlene Pillion from the MK North, and they are really very excellent candidates.
Everyone said we were going to lose, and did I believe we were going to lose? I don't know. I knew that somebody had to stand up. I knew that somebody had to step forward and stand to be the parliamentary candidate. I had a conversation with Pete. I said, one of us has got to do it, and he said, you're doing it.
I was involved with everything. Campaigning, canvassing, involving new people, joining new people, even most of the people I have joined who never hoped that they will be in politics, and when this snap election came, this has encouraged more people, and especially the young generation. And I will say that our Jeremy Corbyn, leader, he has inspired us a lot. He was our only inspiration that, yes, we will get that. And this positive views, positive inspiration has worked all the way through.
As soon as that manifesto was released, the change in people was seismic. You felt it on the doorsteps. You knew straight away that people were reacting to that, and that's what people wanted.
Good morning, Milton Keynes. It's just gone 7 a.m. It's Thursday, the 8th of June. It's election day. So make sure that you get out and remember to vote today.
I might be the teacher, the doctor, the nurse, the carer, the cleaner, putting you first. The driver, shift worker, we work hard each day, making ends meet, some on minimum pay. Serving our country, present and past, a future our children will cherish to last. A risk our NHS will be taken and sold, nothing left to protect us, the young or the old. Our schools and hospitals can't take more cuts. Build housing, create jobs, no ifs and no buts. Change is possible.
Social media definitely played a huge part. We had our sheets of people that we knew we thought we should knock on doors, but those sheets were produced in over the last 20 years, and the people that were on there were not the people necessarily that we were looking to get votes from when you're looking to get votes for someone like Jeremy Corbyn. So the way to reach those people was through social media.
So please vote for me, because change is possible.
On the end of the sky, our sweet love flutters by.
When the election was suddenly called, one of the guy who was in charge of running social media, James Barrett, basically gathered around him a group of us relatively young, relatively technology savvy members, and I think that was a resource base that was not available to the Labour Party at any previous election.
I'll never forget on election day knocking on doors of young people and people who you would never perhaps think would vote. They were young, kind of, you'd think that there's no voting record and stuff. And I remember one chap knocking on the door, and his dad came to the door and he said, "Oh, I'm not voting, I can't bother to vote." And he said, "But him upstairs, he's voting." And this guy came downstairs and he was like, "I'm on my way now to do it, it's so important." He said, "I didn't vote in the the EU referendum, and I regret it because now we believe in the EU and I'm really worried about that." He said, "So I'm definitely going out to vote today." And that was real, the kind of the sense that young people got was that everyone, all their friendship groups were voting Labour. So it was this sense that, it was a real, it's just a movement from young people. And like I said, I think that's brilliant for the Labour Party. I think that's brilliant. Like, it gives us hope, doesn't it, for the future of the country, in that, you've got all these young people who are the next 20, 30 years of voters who genuinely believe in social justice, in equality, and seeing, a better world, which is brilliant.
The first time that maybe in my life I've done something where I thought this is going to have an actual impact. If we get these good policy messages out to the people of Milton Keynes, they will respond, and we will have a realistic chance of getting a Labour MP, which will ultimately change people's lives. So I think that whole process, which was, as I say, was a completely collective effort, but definitely that was my proudest moment. But I've only been in the party for 2.5 years, so this is just the beginning, I think.
Looking back over the 100-year history of the Labour Party in Milton Keynes, we can see that it has embraced a wide variety of people, but all of them have shared a core set of beliefs that have inspired their campaigning.
Equality, equality, tolerance, respect, all of those things which fuel liberty, which fuel the Labour Party's values and agendas, and always will and always must. That must be what we are about. We don't want to be a political party just to achieve government. We want to be a political movement that changes things. I always recommend a book to everybody I speak to. That's Robert Tressel's book, The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist. If that doesn't spark a crusade in you, then nothing ever will.
It's this feeling of solidarity, the feeling that life can and must be made better, and that working collectively we can achieve that. And it is the for the many, not the few. There are only two questions that you ask about every policy: who benefits and who pays. And if you ask those questions, then that helps you to decide where you should be on these different issues: who benefits and who pays.
It's about people. And it's about delivering for people and making people's lives better. And I believe that's what the Labour Party is at its core, and will continue to deliver under whichever kind of background of the party it is. I believe that the Labour Party is, if you're a member of the Labour Party, you're a member of the Labour Party because you believe in a better world and a place where we deliver for people. And I think that's what Labour is for me.
Milton Keynes is a Labour city. It was visioned by Harold Wilson and the Labour government as making sure that people had a good home and a good job and had a nice environment, and was a reaction to people living in slums, people living in poor quality housing, and people doing low value work. And I think there is no separation between the values of the Labour Party and what should be the values, and I think are the values, no matter who they vote for, of the vast majority of people of Milton Keynes, which is actually people came here, they want to do better for themselves, and they're sort of and that sense of self-improvement. And I think 100 years ago, when those trade unionists met in Wolverton, they weren't thinking about the future of Milton Keynes, but I think if you'd have said to them, we want to build a new city with good housing, and people will and your grandchildren in Wolverton will have good jobs, and they'll be going off to university, I think they'd have been very proud of that.